All right, everyone. Welcome to our event with the DC Sustainable Energy Utility. My name is Johannes Urpelainen, and I'm the Prince Sultan bin Abdulaziz Professor and the Director of our Energy Resources and Environment Program here at SAIS. I'm also the Founding Director of the Initiative for Sustainable Energy Policy, or ICEP. And this event is a particular pleasure for me because ICEP and ERE are teaming up with the DC Sustainable Energy Utility as one of our practicum projects this academic year, where we are going to look at how their innovative model might be exported and applied in the context of emerging and developing economies. So DC Sustainable Energy Utility, as we will hear in just a second, has done a lot of really path-breaking work here in DC and elsewhere in the United States. And now the question that interests us a great deal is, could we repeat the same success in a country like India or Indonesia or Ethiopia? That's a very exciting prospect. I work in those countries extensively, so I'm particularly happy about today's event. And what we're going to do today is we are first going to hear from Anmol, who's with DC Sustainable Energy Utility, the Director of Financing Strategies and our kind of contact point with the utility for the project. And then we are going to also hear from Meier, who's a specialist at the World Bank on renewable energy and energy efficiency. And so what we'll do is we'll have both speakers just speak very briefly, let's say 20 minutes or so, so that we'll have enough time, another 40-45 minutes at the end for discussion, depending on how many questions we have. So with that, Anmol, please, why don't you take it away? Really look forward to it. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having me on it. Thank you everyone for coming. It's always nice to come back to the International Affairs School. I went to a lesser known International Affairs School up north called SIPA. I'm glad I'm not hearing any boos. That's good. That's good. So it's forward. There you go. So very quickly, before I get into DCSU, the DCSU by itself is not a corporate entity. It is managed and operated by this company called the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation. That's what the VEIC stands for. And VEIC is a non-profit corporation that started about 3 decades ago in the state of Vermont. Those are the roots of VEIC, and for any one of you who are familiar with Vermont, you know, they have a lot of respect for natural resources and conservation, and that's the sort of ethos that is contained within VEIC's mission. We work in various states, Vermont, DC, Ohio, etc., and opened up an office in Wisconsin shortly. We run a bunch of different programs. We have 3 main lines of business. One is to run sustainable energy utility type programs. We do that in Vermont, in DC, and in Ohio. And the other thing that we do is that when we notice that there is a gap in products and services in energy sustainability, especially as it relates to the underserved market, like affordable housing, small businesses, senior living, we incubate businesses to help overcome those market barriers. And we either spin them off or we grow them on our own balance sheet, but with the intent of demonstrating that there are innovative business models who can rectify market discrepancies. So those are some of the brand names that you see of the businesses that we've incubated in-house. We also have a consulting division that's consulted all across the US and even some international arena, but most of our work is domestic, which is why this presentation and the project we're doing with SAIS is so interesting, because we get to test the hypothesis that this is maybe applicable outside the US as well. So, before I get into the mechanics of DCSU and the impact it's had on DC, I want to explain the context behind why the DCSU was created and why not just DCSU, but the likes of DCSU have a role to play, especially in a market like the US. So, and so these first few slides will be broad generalizations of the utility sector. We can take some other time to go in more depth into utility regulatory reform, but today is not the day for that. But so I'm going to make some generalizations, and I'm happy to take further in-depth discussions about utilities offline. But in general, utilities had a specific 20th century role, which was that they were focused only on economic development and the access to resources goals. That they want to make sure that energy is available for the purpose of economic development and that everyone has equal access to resources. And you know, we tend to forget, but utilities were actually, in many ways, you know, socialist corporations, because no matter where you lived in the city, you had access to a pole and wire, and you didn't pay more just because you were in a far-flung suburb or whether you were in downtown in a commercial real estate. So in many ways, it was a social engine of progress. However, that paradigm is not sufficient to meet the 21st century goals of climate change mitigation, sustainability, etc., because that was not in mind when they designed the utility in the 19th and 20th century. So utility frameworks globally focus on capital and operational efficiency without giving much thought to resource efficiency and environmental impact. And a cursory search online to see whether that is true, because this was again a broad generalization. And the first utility I went to in the developing world was from the state of Maharashtra in India, which is where I grew up. And the Maharashtra State Electricity Distribution Limited's mandate is, we as a professional company, we dedicate ourselves to accept all challenges to serve our consumers by supplying reliable and quality power at reasonable and competitive tariffs so as to boost agricultural, industrial, and overall economic development of Maharashtra. So as you see, a great focus, which is reliable and economic supply for the purpose of economic development, but not a single mention of doing it in a way that conserves resources and helps meet our goals. The second thing which I learned in my association with the energy sector, and my previous life I used to be an investment banker, and this is about the third point, about financial markets view utilities as a business model that produce stable revenue and profits in eternity. There's no disruption allowed, because why would anyone not want to consume more electricity? And it's shocking when I think about it, but I was once working on the acquisition of a utility in the US, which was listed on the stock market but was taken private using some private equity. And when I worked on the financial model, it's shocking to me now, they assume that for 30 years there'll be constant increase in the growth of in basically energy supply. They assumed even in the early 2000s that the amount of energy bought from the utility would continue to increase. Clearly, the utility did not see a role for energy efficiency as a way to meet their customers' needs. And the sort of investors who actually took the company private were looking for long-term stable returns. They were not looking at the utility as a technologically driven company that would sort of attune itself and adapt to the evolving technology environment. And finally, the most tragic thing is that many privately owned utilities have actively worked against climate change policies, whether it's at the local level by opposing net metering, or whether it's at the more national level by basically funding think tanks that don't believe or actively deny climate change or climate science. Now, zooming a little closer to the ground in terms of the energy utility sector in the US. As you all may know, regulated energy utilities in the US, like in many parts of the world, are allowed by regulators to set tariffs in a way that they earn a return on capital assets that they have basically put in place to supply, and if you're vertically integrated, then to generate, transmit, and supply electricity. And so basically they have a cost plus model. The more energy is supplied, the more revenue they're able to earn. So there's really no natural incentive for them to reduce the amount of units sold, whether it's, in the case of energy, whether it's electricity or natural gas, and whether it's a water utility in terms of water distributed. And so in certain states like Vermont, like DC, and California, state regulators who regulate these utilities recognize this discrepancy. And so they propose mandates telling the regulated utility that since you don't have an incentive, I'm going to put a mandate on you that you have to reduce your demand by X% every year. So you have to do some effort to show that you're doing something about efficiency, although it's not a naturally aligned, although it's not naturally aligned to your business model. So utilities, so efficiency programs run by utilities, whether through a mandate by the regulator or for some reason they feel that it makes sense for the business model, because there are certain utility regulatory frameworks in the US that do allow for decoupling, where it doesn't matter how much you sell, you're able to true up your tariffs in order to meet the revenue targets. That it's basically an amazing business to be in. So the programs that utilities undertake in the US, whether meet mandates or because they think it helps them maintain the revenue, are known broadly as utility efficiency programs. And these efficiency programs are either run by utilities in-house or they contract with third parties to run them. And again, broad generalizations and nuances. It's a highly federal state sort of dual control sector with a lot of responsibility and autonomy given to states. So lots of nuances, but these are broad generalizations. And these efficiency programs aren't small. Together in the US, about $7.5 billion were spent in 2015 on efficiency programs. Now, there are some obvious shortcomings in efficiency programs led by utilities. First is a lopsided focus on doing the bare minimum to meet the mandates, and in absence of mandates, the cheapest savings that they can find. Basically, if their rate of return start reducing by going deeper into efficiency, they would rather not do it. If the customer type is a difficult customer where it takes more hand-holding to achieve efficiency, they would rather not do it. So a lot of the efficiency projects tend to be in commercial real estate and lighting, which is the easiest way to get savings. And ultimately, utilities are behemoths. These are huge corporations. So the amount of management attention given to utility programs that they run is minimal. They do it when it is the easiest thing to do and when they have to comply with mandates, but it is not something that the top management is trained in. It is not something that the engineers are particularly focused on. It's not something their institutional setup is attuned to. And there's a lack of internal motivation for continuous improvement and adopting new technologies, which are beneficial for the customer, if not necessarily the utility. So certain states recognize this, that maybe getting utilities to reduce their own revenue is not the best way to get at this. So why don't we take the mandate away from them and give it to a third-party administrator? So utilities, you do what you're doing, and we'll give the mandate to a third-party administrator to run efficiency programs. Now, VEIC is one of those third-party administrators who contract with cities, states to run these programs, but we have a particular twist on it, and that twist is the sustainable energy utility concept. Basically, we look at it as a efficiency program on steroids. And so before I get into the next slide, the VEIC does have a way of looking at their role. And this is a philosophy of VEIC that led to the development of the energy efficiency utility and the sustainable energy utility concept. It is that, as I mentioned earlier, utilities, the distribution utilities, and the vertically integrated utilities where they still exist, have played a vital function in helping economic development in the US and other parts of the world. And their mandate of supplying affordable, efficient, and safe energy is something to be respected. And we should encourage them to do better on those metrics as much as they can. But then to also expect them as a mechanism to deliver the mirror image of what's required, which is efficiency, distributed generation, resiliency at the grid's edge, is just it's counterintuitive in many ways. So VEIC's philosophy is, let's not muddle the core competencies. Let utilities do what they do best, which is the supply of efficient, safe, and reliable energy. And you create a separate entity let's call this sustainable energy utility, which does the opposite, where they are given a mandate to supply efficiency, distributed generation, and resiliency off the grid. And then let the two entities compete. So for a consumer, they have a choice. Either you buy grid-connected electricity from the distribution utility, or you get in touch with the sustainable energy utility and buy energy efficiency. Or you figure out how to get distributed generation on your roof through the SEU. And if the SEU can deliver those goods and services cheaper than the grid, so be it. But ultimately, we'll be in a better place with these two entities competing with each other than trying to put two competing agenda on the same entity, which is a utility. And that is the VEIC philosophy behind the sustainable energy utility. But VEIC went one step further. They said not only will we try to create a mirror image on purely the energy side, we'll also look at the SEU as as a way to achieve energy justice. The energy sector, as you all know, while it has led to great economic development, has also helped perpetuate a lot of inequity in the world, whether it's to natural resource extraction or through the use of electricity and all the externalities that come from the extraction, transmission, and use of electricity, energy. So the SEU is also trying to rectify the injustice from energy use by embedding such goals, and I'll get into how we do that. So, forgetting what you know of utilities, if you can think of a utility which is aligned with the environmental and climate goals of your city, state, country, focuses principally on delivering efficiency and distributed renewable energy, and now even resiliency, catalyzes underserved market for clean energy, helps reduce social inequity, creates green jobs, provides workforce development, supports local businesses, and is actively involved in creating a sustainable energy future rather than trying to put roadblocks, well, that's our vision for an SEU. And we think with the DC SEU, we've reached maybe 70% of the way of what our vision is, but I'm sure we can do better. So with that, let me get into the DC SEU. How am I doing on time, Johannes?
Another 10 minutes.
Perfect. So, the context first. So DC, before the DCSU was launched, had efficiency programs run by PEPCO for electricity, gas efficiency programs run by Washington Gas, which is their gas utility, and the district government ran efficiency programs for the low-income population. Obviously, the legislators realized that's a very inefficient way to run efficiency programs with 3 separate programs not talking to each other, not exploiting synergies. So the legislators in DC took a trip to Vermont, figured out what VEIC was doing in Vermont through Efficiency Vermont, which was America's first energy efficiency utility, and adapted that model by embedding social equity goals to make it a sustainable energy utility. And so they passed the Clean and Affordable Energy Act in 2008, which mandated the creation of the DCSEU as a program, and it was then put out to bid for a private contractor to implement that program. And VEIC, being a leader in the space, along with some local partners, won that contract for the first time in 2010, and it was put out for rebid in 2016, and we won it again for the next 5 years. So we are here till 2021, and it's, if both parties mutually agree, we'll be here for another 5 years after that. So the context in DC is that it's a high energy consumption per capita city, but it's mostly because of the amount of economic activity that happens here. So the population of DC is around 650,000 people, but during daytime that swells to about 1 million because of the number of people that come in, which has obvious implications on the amount of energy used in DC. So again, as a city conscious of its environmental footprint, there was a drive to reduce that. Second is that DC has the highest concentration of LEED Platinum buildings in the country, but it also has some of the oldest housing stock in the country. So a wide variety of energy consumption per square foot in the city. It's also a very unequal city, as all you residents know, with a lot of disparity in income levels and wealth. And this graph here this image always blows my mind. And these percentages are the unemployment percentages in each of those wards. So Ward 7 and Ward 8, which are across the river, clearly not exhibiting the same economic development as the rest of the city. There's a high degree of environmental stewardship, which is evident by some of the policies they've taken, like the RPS, etc. There's also a plethora of well-run service providers in the energy efficiency field, but they are spread out across the DMV area, the DC, Maryland, Virginia, and like many of the same companies across the US, they are facing with aging workforce issues. 60% of technically qualified HVAC employees will retire in the next 10 years. And that's a huge issue for many of the efficient service providers. And finally, although there are service providers available, very few DC-based companies are actually in this because of the high operating costs and living costs of establishing business in here. So with those in mind, the DCSU was launched with the mandate that, the broad mandate to help all energy users, household, businesses, institutions, with another mandate to help local businesses grow and become competitive in this field. And finally, to provide basically momentum to a green economy in the long run. It's a performance-based contract, and I'll get into financial setup, but DC also recognizes that they didn't want to put all their eggs in one basket without de-risking themselves. So this is a performance-based contract, which is whoever wins the DCSU contract has to achieve a certain minimum number of savings benchmarks every year and other benchmarks, otherwise they get fined and they can even get the contract yanked off them. So what's the financial setup of DCSU? All energy consumers, electricity and gas in the district, have a little surcharge, systems benefit charge on the utility bill, which gets pooled into the Sustainable Energy Trust Fund right here, which is under the control of the district government, the contracting agency. The DCSU, which is our team, receives funding from the trust fund to run our operations, and the operating costs are staff salaries and office expenses, but vast majority of the funding goes into project subsidies, are our primary driver for getting people to do efficiency and renewable energy, and workforce development and contractor trainings. So DCSU actually spends our own sort of working capital, and once we prove on a monthly basis to the district government that we've actually spent it on these allowable expenses, they reimburse us. So from the city's point of view, they've de-risked themselves from fraudulent expenditure also, because if we spend on things which are not allowed, they won't pay us. So they are de-risked from that point. So the ratepayers are de-risked from that point. In terms of the performance contract, at the end of each year, which runs the October to September fiscal year, a third-party evaluator evaluates our annual performance, submits a report to the district government, and if we have met our minimum performance benchmarks, it's good, we get to work the next year. But if we don't, we actually get fined. So that's how they de-risk themselves. But if we also hit our maximum benchmarks, we get a performance bonus. So it is sort of a pay-for-success model that we hear about as being a new innovation, but we don't call it that, but it's pretty much that for all intents and purposes. These are the goals in our contract. We have to achieve X amount of electricity savings every year, gas savings, create X amount of green jobs, and 30% of our budget has to be spent on low-income buildings, and that includes affordable housing, health clinics, and shelters. 30% of our contracting budget has to be spent on local businesses. And so that's how the social equity goals are embedded in this contract, by ensuring that we're not going for the cheapest savings in commercial real estate, but also going to the underserved market segments. And we're not just using the cheapest contractor in the area, but also going for local businesses. And finally, we have a renewable mandate as well. So these are examples of how we deliver our offerings to the customers. If you go to a vast majority of the retail stores in DC, your LED bulb is at half price than what it would have normally been, because we create discounts at the retail level. So that's the obvious thing you'll buy when you go there. For anyone trying to do a project that is more complicated than just switching out a light bulb, we provide technical assistance and project subsidies. For those energy users who can't access the capital markets, we help facilitate financing to them. That is sort of my role at DCSU and at VIC broadly. And finally, we do workforce development, job creation, education, outreach, etc. Examples of projects: we helped the Canadian Embassy swap out a whole bunch of light bulbs, lots of savings. We helped implement a federal mandate that President Obama had on federal buildings for solar on those GSA buildings. Some figures on our impact since 2012, for about $60 million of spend. Well, these numbers are till 2015. So $60 million of spend create about 500 million lifetime energy savings, and 3 million tons of lifetime CO2 emissions prevented. If you remember the map of DC, before we started, and we looked at the sort of, we did a geospatial analysis to see where the solar PV was installed, and less than 5% were in Ward 7, Ward 8. Since then, about 20% of PV installations have started there, have now been there, because of the low-income solar program that we ran. Again, a great way in we affects social energy justice. We then commissioned a study from a third party saying, all right, we understand the energy output of what we do, but we want to understand the economic development angle in this. And so they did some modeling, and they figured out that for every dollar invested in the DCSU, about $4.5 worth of economic benefit was generated for the city, whether it's through avoided energy costs, reinvestment of working capital, which is now available, increased consumption because now you're not spending on energy anymore, or the benefits that local businesses get because we support their effort. Finally, we also did a mapping of the SEU and the Sustainable Development Goals, and we hit about 8 of 17 of them. We're in the end, Johannes? Is it
Pretty much, yes.
Pretty much? All right, so last couple of slides. So final thoughts. We don't look at the SEU as a one-size-fits-all solution. So we're not saying that the DCSU is a solution. For us, the SEU is a platform that allows a city or a state to meet its energy sustainability goals. So the DCSU will not look like the Delhi SEU or the Bogota SEU. The SEU does not have to recreate the wheel. Ultimately, it'll address the market gap. So if a city has all these wonderful service providers and products already on the market, we don't have to recreate any of that. We just have to provide access to it and make sure they are at an equal parity as compared to buying electricity off the grid. But where a market gap exists, we can help in workforce creation, support local businesses, and create incentives that drive consumption towards more efficient products and appliances and distributed generation. And finally, the SEU concept can be extended to mobility and industrial energy consumption also. It doesn't have to be urban. And some of the stuff that made us think about why this could be useful is when we looked at some of the research and debates happening in the international context. So there was a workshop on the role of utilities in future, and the discussion was about the fact that the pace of power sector reforms has slowed down. And you can debate about how that was measured, but if they looked at the amount of actions taken, that has slowed down since 2005. In the first wave of regulatory reforms, off-grid solutions were ignored. And frankly, there's now a recognition that these regulatory reforms are not adapting themselves to the new wave of technology that's coming online. And then I look for a particular example for a country, and I picked India, of course. And there was a report by the World Bank about the potential in India, and it turns out that only a handful of utilities and ESCOs have focused on appliances, whether that's for cooling rather, or other appliances. They just haven't. And cost-effective savings from 20% of future appliance energy use can avoid construction of 150 new power plants. But there are no such programs that incentivize the use of energy-efficient appliances at the city and state level. The Fed, at least in India, the federal government has done a few things, but it doesn't percolate the way it should at the local level. With that, I will stop. I have a few slides on financing, but we can get to it if we need to. But I believe that's more to it. Anyway.
Fantastic. Right. Thanks so much. So, please. The floor is all yours. I'll just set up the PowerPoint. There you go.
Thank you. Hi everyone, good afternoon. My name is Meier. I'm a SAIS alumna from 2008, so I'm happy to be back in my alma mater, having lots of flashbacks, and I think it's actually the first time I've been back in this building since I graduated. But it's a pleasure to come back and talk to you today. I've been at the World Bank since I left SAIS, again, about 10 years now. First I was in the climate change group for my first 6 years, where I was focused mainly on carbon finance, so looking at under the cap and trade schemes under the Kyoto Protocol, managing 2 different carbon funds there. And the past 4 years I've been in the energy and extractives global practice in the Latin America and Caribbean region. So that's my regional expertise, but I do have some information. I know there's been some focus on India, and I'll try to bring experience from my colleagues as well, from Indian experience. Okay, so similar to Amal, I mean, some of these things are a bit obvious, I guess, but I think it's still worth taking a couple moments to reiterate. So why, let's see, the slide is not showing all the way. You're not seeing the header on the slides, but if there's anything to do about that. Anyway, I'll just tell you what they say. Why is it worth pursuing energy efficiency in developing countries? So we have this nice diagram we've made at the World Bank here looking at all the different benefits, economic benefits that can come from energy efficiency improvement. I think that while it seems really intuitive, you always have to remember that there's scarce funds within these countries that they need to deploy to promote economic development, and they have really compelling priorities in education and health. So it can be a really hard sell, as much as you feel passionate about it and there's really hard economic and financial evidence of the benefits that can bring. It can be difficult to convince governments that this is something that they should prioritize in their budgets. And so I think some of the most compelling things that I've seen work is looking at prices, industrial productivity, public budgets, disposable income, as much as even local air pollution and poverty alleviation, which I think is also related to the disposable income. But unfortunately, sometimes GHG emissions is not really the entry point for that dialogue with countries. But there's the progress that had been made at Paris, and countries have submitted targets for meeting climate mitigation goals, trying to keep global warming below 2 degrees. And this is a slide from the IEA, which shows that basically with all the NDC commitments here, we're going to quite overshoot the 2-degree target. So there still has to be a lot of what they call the bridge scenario. What else needs to be done beyond what's in the NDCs in order to get to that 2-degree level? And you can see they expect about 50% of those actions need to come from energy efficiency in order to do it in a way that doesn't harm economic growth. So energy efficiency has a huge role to play, but unfortunately it just doesn't get the same kind of attention that some of the other actions like renewables get. So as I mentioned, countries have energy policies that are meant to meet multiple different objectives, including many of the things that Anmol outlined. The good news is that, so there's sort of good news and bad news. Good news is that we're finally seeing in OECD countries on the left-hand side here decoupling of energy intensity and GDP growth. So demonstrating that this can be done, you can continue to grow economically without growing your energy use. But unfortunately, none of my slides are fitting. I really don't know how to fix this, but anyway, the yellow bar is the low-income countries, and this is the sort of low-middle income countries. So you can see there's still pretty high energy intensity in a lot of the poorest economies, and that's where a lot of the growth is going to happen. Particularly in the residential sector, we have a lot of people coming out of poverty and purchasing air conditioning and other sorts of energy-using equipment to improve their quality of life. So there's still quite a challenge to figure out how to, in an equitable way, bring down the energy intensity in developing countries. So I thought these were some interesting examples of how energy efficiency has been used in increasing resilience. I think this can be a compelling story to tell when you're going to talk to countries about why energy efficiency can be important. So this is a slide looking at in Japan after the 2011 earthquake and the Fukushima meltdown. They basically Japan shut off all of their 49 nuclear reactors. And this shows here how they basically had to compensate by increasing coal, gas, and oil production. But you can see they also put in a pretty aggressive plan for energy conservation. They had mandatory targets for industrial and commercial users. I think it was 15% that they needed to decrease their use. But what was good is that after those mandatory requirements ended around 2014, a lot of those benefits, companies realized that this was actually beneficial for their own bottom lines, and those benefits materialized in terms of long-term energy efficiency. So they actually displaced the use of carbon-intensive generation going forward, but also saved a massive amount of money for the economy in terms of avoiding blackouts, brownouts, and allowing them to maintain some GDP growth in light of that crisis. And then another example of energy efficiency in a time of crisis was in Brazil in 2001. There was the worst drought in Brazil's history. So the reservoirs were actually threatened to go completely dry. And so they had to put in really tight energy conservation measures where they had mandatory reductions for all consumers, including residential users. They were supposed to reduce by 20% their consumption in that year. And they were allowed to trade their targets. So customers that were able to achieve more were allowed to trade with other customers that were able to achieve less to get the most efficient outcome. And they managed to, this shows about a 10% drop. I think in a 9-month period, it actually reduced consumption by about 20% and it saved GDP. They were able to have no blackouts and savings about 1.5% of GDP over that period. So energy efficiency can be a really powerful tool for resilience. And sometimes that's an important story to sell when talking to governments and, about the importance. So why doesn't it happen though? There's policy barriers, which I think that have already been covered. Some of the transaction and opportunity costs, looking at the fragmented markets, particularly residential users and low-income users, multifamily homes. Even in the case of industries where it can be easier to make a case because they can smaller number of actors and they can really reap these benefits directly financially. They often have other priorities. While it might you have the engineering teams that come with a great proposal of how they can save $5 million on their O&M costs from new boilers, etc. The people in the finance team, they want to look at, well, what about expanding our plant? And that's like a more traditional investment, and they have a limited amount of space on their balance sheet. So coming up with innovative financing solutions to help overcome those barriers is really important. Lack of information and track record, as well as some of the misaligned incentives, the typical principal agent problem with rental units and multifamily homes, and behavioral changes. So this is just a quick overview. I won't go into much detail, but of World Bank lending and energy efficiency. So about $14.5 billion over the past 8 years, over 178 investment operations. These are our regional categories: South Asia, MENA, Middle East, North Africa, Latin America, Europe and Central Asia, East Asia Pacific, and Africa. So you can see there's still quite a lot of investment in the low-income segments, but most of those were done in supply side. And it is a challenge to push demand-side energy efficiency in those countries. This is a quick overview of some of our demand-side energy efficiency examples. So our largest programs are, we have over $1 billion in China, India. There's some large flagship projects, actually a new one that was just approved that I'll talk about in a little while. I've been working on this project in Brazil to finance energy efficiency in public street lighting and industries. And then we have a number of interesting ones in Mexico as well, looking at residential users, refrigerators, et cetera, and also looking at municipal energy efficiency with street lighting and water energy efficiency. So we have this sort of ladder looking at different models for promoting investment. So those where you have larger amounts of public financing going all the way up to commercial financing, trying to convey the message that as markets mature, you can move from more subsidized approaches to more market-based approaches. And that is our goal. There's a big push in the World Bank now, you may or may not know, and all end multilateral development banks on maximizing finance for development, which is one of our lovely buzzwords, MFD it's called, to basically make sure that we're using our scarce public resources in the most efficient way possible. So trying to move away from direct lending whenever we can towards catalyzing, leveraging our funds to bring in private sector financing. But I think that utility on-bill financing here, the role of utilities is probably is going to be expanding in different ways. And you have the example of the sustainable energy utility, which can work in different areas along this ladder. But we also see that their role is probably going to change with some of the disruptive forces that are happening in the market. So I wanted to talk about just a couple examples of some of the new generation of business models that we're seeing in our projects. Market aggregation to drive down equipment prices. So this is quite similar to what has been done in the DC Sustainable Energy Utility. We have a project in Mexico where there's a large SOE, basically, a bank that operates. It was has a public mandate and it received public funding, and it takes on debt from MDBs backed by the Ministry of Finance, which is known as Energy Efficiency Services Limited, EESL. And it's been a hugely successful, it calls itself a super ESCO. And one of their most successful stories was bulk procurement of LEDs in India. They've procured, I think they've had over, I can't remember the figures, 300 million LEDs installed. It's incredible what they've done. And that number just keeps growing. They have a great website where you can, if you Google it, you can see they have a daily ticker of how many different bulbs have been installed. And what they're most proud of is their ability to drive down prices in the market. So LEDs were about $10 per bulb when they started, and now they're $1. And that's basically those benefits that they've gotten from aggregated procurement and also quality control. We have revolving EE funds for in public sector in Mexico, so as I was mentioning before. Some of in Brazil, guarantee programs where we are working with a local public bank to help them create a guarantee so that they will do some direct lending in projects, in energy efficiency projects and street lighting and industries, but they're trying to bring in commercial lenders, the domestic commercial market, so banks like Santander and Itaú. In order to do that, they're offering credit enhancement mechanisms to try to push towards a more project finance based approach for financing energy efficiency, using as little as funds as possible. And we have money there from the Green Climate Fund and Green Technology Fund, so there's a lot of interest from these climate funds to help either provide some concessional funds or underwrite some of the risks involved in putting some of these more innovative models forward. In terms of, there's some interesting examples as well with standard offers. I mean, this is the role of utilities in South Africa, the utility Eskom. They faced an energy crisis and they did something with a standard offer where basically they agreed to buy at a fixed price, as a predefined price, basically megawatts. So companies or individuals that were able to say, you know, we are going to reduce our consumption or shift our load, we'll pay you X per megawatt hour reduced, and that allowed them to, again, avoid blackouts, brownouts, and save a lot of energy. So, but the problem is in this case, and we'll come to this later, is that this was a publicly funded program, and now some of the funds have been reduced, so their impact is also reduced at the same time. So how do you come up with sustainable financing approaches in order to make sure that these things can continue on, not just in a crisis mode? So these are some of the disruptive forces of digital utility. This is a McKinsey photo. So I just wanted to point out that there are a lot of changes happening in how utilities will end up doing business. Right? You have a lot of solar prices falling, a lot of customers moving into distributed generation, and that's projected to grow significantly. So utilities have always, the issue of how do you bring in energy efficiency has been very difficult for utilities because under the traditional remuneration approaches, they couldn't, it was just financially a losing adventure for them. So why would they ever do it? They didn't have the incentives. But that's going to have to be somewhat sorted out as they look at how to bring in distributed generation into their business models, and how do they play for demand response. So I think there's two elements. One is that the business model hopefully will adapt, although there's going to be other market actors that are coming in and trying to fill that space if the utilities don't move quickly enough. And the other is the complementarity between energy efficiency and renewable energy. In the classic duck curve that you see in California, where you have increasing penetration. I should have put a slide, maybe you've seen it, but if not, it's quite interesting to Google and look up the increasing penetration of renewables. Then you have a huge ramp up. You have a big dip when solar is plentiful during the day in supply, and then a huge ramp up in the evening. And if you can use energy efficiency to try to shift load or reduce load at that peak, you can really help utilities manage their assets. This is just a quick slide to show that you have more big players, you can't see it very well, coming into the space of energy efficiency and demand response. So EDF, the French utility, has acquired a smaller company that was looking at how to bring demand response services outside of a utility, the traditional utility approach, and then Shell also is moving into the space, and there's others. So if utilities don't move fast, others will. So some of the key messages is there are a lot of low-hanging fruits in developing countries, but they can be hard to harvest. There's a lot of barriers to entry. I think communication of these benefits is critical, but quite difficult. I think that shouldn't be overlooked. There's a big role for utilities sustainable energy utilities to play. I think everybody has a role to play if we're going to meet this 50% contribution to the reduction in GHG emissions that IEA forecasts. And it's just a matter of making sure that when those programs are deployed, that they're done in a way that is most efficiently using those funds, but still maintaining some of these social justice and sustainable development goals as well. So I think this can even be saved for discussion. This slide here, I think I'll touch on these points if we go through sort of the pros and cons of applying a DCSU model in developing countries.
Fantastic. So, Megan, if I may ask, why don't you join me and Almo in the front,
sure.
So we can have a
a
little conversation there. And is it anywhere you want? Just there. Just, make it easier for me and for the audience to kind of know where we need to look.
Yeah.
So this is great. What I'll do is I'll ask a few questions to get us started. So I'll ask one question each of you, and then after that I'll just open it for the audience, so we can have a somewhat broader conversation. So Anmol, on your presentation, I was quite interested in this comment that you made about these policies in countries like India, where you don't see a lot of action at the low level. So you don't see Delhi sustainable energy utility or anything like that, but you do see things at the federal level, possibly sometimes at the state level. So what do you think would be the drivers for some of these cities to get excited about these projects? Megan already mentioned things like air pollution and maybe some efficiency gains and all, but how do we get this started in these countries?
I guess great question. And the one example of I know how it got started is DC. So maybe looking back about what worked was local governance and economic development issues. And ultimately, people sitting in Delhi don't understand Bombay's mayor's issues when it comes to how to make sure his constituents have reliable supply, air is clean, etc. It is not an election issue for the Delhi government. It's an election issue for the local government. So I really think the more you can tie in, and like Megan was saying, sometimes, and in fact many times, even in my past international development work, the co-benefits of many of these mitigation actions are the more powerful tool to make an action happen than the actual mitigation. The GHG emission becomes a co-benefit, and the health impacts, the quality of life, the business continuity, etc. I think those are the issues which have to be linked to governance and better, let's say, election outcomes for politicians. I think that's the way you get this done.
And how do you think, follow up on that, in many of these countries, the electricity utilities are in significantly worse shape than they're here, as you must know very well. So how do you think that influences this whole business? Is it an obstacle for programs like this, or an opportunity, or?
I'm the eternal optimist. For me, it's an opportunity.
Okay.
It's the opportunity to not have your sustainability goals, your dire sustainability goals be linked to institutions that can't get out of their own way. Like the distribution utilities in India are in terrible financial shape. And to then get them to innovate you're never going to get there. And I think part of the discussion in that study that I saw, led by SMAP, was that these institutions are now not able to undertake more reforms anymore, the sort of reforms we need to meet climate goals. So to me, it's an opportunity.
Fantastic. So Megan, from your presentation, you mentioned that often the entry point in these conversations would be these co-benefits. So how do you feel when you go to governments as the bank or anybody else and propose these new initiatives on efficiency? What is the reaction? What goes into these conversations? Can you just give us maybe some examples? No need to name any names or anything, but I'd just love to hear how that actually works in practice.
I think that in practice what happens is we manage to, you go in and you have some energy dialogue, and there could be a lot of interesting programs that they want to do, and the bank will engage on those. But we try to use that as a way to then we have an entry point into the dialogue with that country. And then mean, in practice, what usually happens is that we get some donor funding to do studies where we can demonstrate these benefits and tell the story in a compelling way. And then try to put together, working with our clients, a proposal of something that has, some win-win, some hook that will bring them into the dialogue. But that process can take years. And there may need to be policy reforms put in place in order to make, whatever you want to do on the financing side effective. You have to have some kind of mandates or targets. So it can take a really long time, which I think it becomes really an act in perseverance. Unless you have visionaries, which you do have in the case. I mean, I think that sometimes, of course, it's nice to see local action at the city level, but it's like a huge blessing when you have a federal engagement. Because otherwise, in some cases in the U.S., you may see this happening more at the city level because we've done such a poor job at the federal level. I mean, comparing to India, it's still, the U.S. isn't doing bad on energy efficiency, but the political commitment to set, any kind of national targets, et cetera, has been very challenging. So we tend to work at all levels, but I think I've found I've been working a lot in cities, and it can be, you can have visionaries, et cetera, but when you have that federal mandate, then everything can really click into place and things can move a lot faster.
Okay, excellent. So we have a great audience here. Many of our students, external visitors as well. That's great. So why don't we hear some questions, comments from the audience? Just raise your hand and we'll take it from there. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Colin. I'm a student at SICE, and I had a question for both of you, but specifically something you said, Megan, about the World Bank trying to kind of leverage private funds to bring in or make public funds or bank funds go further. I'm wondering, as we're entering a world where customer-sided technologies are increasingly used as infrastructure solutions, if there's been any kind of analysis or in-depth look at leveraging consumer funds in a similar way. Maybe this is less applicable to low-income households, but maybe middle-income households through like partial rebates or partial subsidies you'd be able to expand deployment of these sorts of technologies further than you would have if it was just the DCSEU paying for it or the consumer paying for it. So I don't know if there's been talk about that in where you guys are working.
Can I ask a clarifying question? What do you mean by consumer funds? Do you mean
money that people pay for anything, like
right.
money that a household has?
Right. So go on. I just needed that clarification.
Okay. I think if I understand your question correctly, one of the examples is in these green mortgages. So customers want to either refinance or buy new mortgages, and they're able to put in additional funds for energy efficiency or distributed generation investments. Mm-hmm. And then those green mortgages can be securitized, and that capital can be recycled and brought to the market. So I think there's the PACE program in California that's also expanded, and there's some programs like that in Pennsylvania as well that have worked to basically use residential assets and consumers' willingness to invest, but wanting to wrap that into their mortgage, and then making it innovative where that asset actually stays with the house. As a new buyer comes in, they take over ownership of the whole package, energy efficiency and the house itself. I don't know if that answers your question. It's just one example I can think of. Go ahead.
Yeah, and maybe it's worth clarifying. So while our primary driver is project subsidies for DCSU, our project subsidies only cover 10% of the total project cost.
Okay.
So ultimately, the consumer is paying for 90%. Mm-hmm. And DC, again, like I explained, is a highly unequal city, right? So most commercial customers, they're happy to get that 10% to buy the more high efficient boiler or whatever. But then we have a process in place is that when a customer tells us, I love the fact you're giving me 10%, but I don't have the 90%, that's when we kick a process and I step in and say, all right, now let me figure out which financing solution works best for you. So we have partnerships with about 8 different lenders, and then we tailor the right financing solution for that customer. So the idea is not free ridership. That, in the utility industry, that's bad word. Like, we don't want people who can afford to pay for it to get free public money. So we obviously calibrate our incentives, like we call them, to change behavior, not necessarily give out handouts.
Yes.
I'm curious how DCSEU works in terms of incentivizing rental property owners to install energy efficiencies, especially ones that are maybe own just one or two rental properties. What are they doing to try and get them to install some of these low-hanging fruit improvements? I know the last 3 places I lived in DC, I've taken out every incandescent light bulb that was in the light bulb socket and put in the LEDs that have traveled with me around. So I'm just curious about your thoughts on that.
No, and I think Megan touched upon this. That's one of the problems with energy efficiency is a split incentive. And that there is no silver bullet for that, unfortunately, even in DC. One way we've been able to overcome that is that we enter into corporate partnerships with operators of these rental buildings, so that every time there's a tenant turnover, they go in and they replace the lighting, etc. But again, the problem remains. For a lot of these operators of rental properties, they just don't care because they're not paying for it.
Do you think, like, as a policy solution, you can look more towards requiring landlords to foot energy bills as a way to, I mean, they can obviously charge it into rent, but that would somehow incentivize them to add these efficiency improvements to their buildings?
On one hand, so there's 2 ways of looking at it. So master meter building, the one you're referring to, that's perfect for driving efficiency with the building owner, because they are the ones on the hook, and they apportion, like you said. But then as a, this is the US after all, there's a big emphasis on personal responsibility. So they want sub-metering as a policy. They want people to be in charge, and people maybe want to be in charge of their own energy use, rather than having to cross-subsidize maybe a more inefficient neighbor of theirs. So there's 2 ways of looking at how that solves the issue. But from our perspective, it's much easier to make a master metered building efficient than a sub-metered building. Absolutely.
Yes.
Yeah, I have 2 questions on DCSU. So a lot of energy efficiency programs in the other parts of the country, typically the IOU sort of manages it. So I'm just curious to see if you guys have done any comparison to the performance in terms of uptake and customer service, about how this model might be a better approach than sort of other efficiency programs in other parts of the country. And then secondly, have you looked at sort of how the performance of your program, is it helping are you able to influence the resource planning for Pepco? Because are you sort of doing are you showing demand reduction, and then can you use that to sort of drive better decision making for Pepco, which is this interstate utility and investing in coal and fossil fuels?
Great questions, both of them. Utilities come in all shapes and sizes, right? There are some cooperatives that show tremendous performance because they are not for-profit entities. They are owned by the constituents, and those utilities and their efficiency programs are world class. But then there are investor-owned utilities where they're responding to mandates from regulators, and I can safely say our programs outscored all of them, but not necessarily every utility, especially when the utility is a cooperative. So that's, I guess, the first. And this is a highly benchmarked industry. There's complete transparency, to the extent it's possible, about how different programs are doing. And we get rated every year, all our programs, whether it's in Ohio, Vermont, or DC. So we know where we lie, and we know we are among the top 10% in all of these. But there are utilities that really good because they have different motives, different objectives. Second part of the question, we can do better in terms of working with the local utility. Now, as you can imagine, there's a certain amount of tension, which is natural. And I think that stops us from working closer together. But I think increasingly we are being looked as a non-wires alternative, which is the industry term for figuring out how to meet capacity demand without putting in poles and wires. So if let's say a transformer has to be replaced in Mount Vernon Square, then they have invited us to figure out whether us using deep efficiency and the resulting load reduction can actually lead to deferring that capital expenditure for the next 10 years. That's the sort of stuff we are getting more and more into, but we haven't done it with great results.
So going off the light bulb comment earlier, I'm just wondering if you could go into a little bit more depth about the rebate program in DC. So I was just at Giant last week to buy a new LED bulb, and I noticed the price was still 7 times higher than the incandescent. And then I believe if you could go into a little bit more detail about, I think you mentioned in 2015, you said there's $7.5 billion invested in energy efficiency.
Right.
So I'm just curious to know what the geographic distribution looks like, and if it's the majority is in places like California, DC, Vermont, or if you know if it's.
I think I'll have to get back to you on both questions. Like I said, we have retail level partnerships with many retailers, but maybe Giant's not one of them because it should be 7 times the cost of an incandescent. So I'll have to look up whether that's outside of our scope or current partnerships. And the second, honestly, I don't know. The second.
So you work with the rebate, it's retail as well as like local businesses, or is it mainly large chains?
So no, we work local. So you know, especially hardware stores, because that's where people tend to go. You know, when they need to buy a whole bunch of bulbs. So we definitely have arrangements with Home Depot, Lowe's, and then with more local chains like what's that? Annie's Hardware and stuff like that. So basically, all the scale doesn't matter.
Okay.
But I'm sure we've missed out many.
Thank you.
How do you use the internet in holding the meetings to get people together and the funding and keeping track of things?
How do we use the internet?
Yeah.
I would say we can do better. I mean, we don't use this might sound silly and archaic, but when we give subsidies for projects, we still mail them checks. But that is just unfortunately the operating rules for a contract with the DC government. So to a large extent, our ability to innovate is stymied by the expectations of the contract that we have. But I mean, all of this should be moved to Venmo, in my opinion. But
Yes.
Hi, yeah, thank you. So both of you mentioned about replicate the similar project in emerging countries or developing countries, and I'm just wondering, like, because among all this developing market, what would be the criteria for you to choose this idea? I'm gonna put this model out, and like whether from policy or finance or all the other private sectors, all the concerns that you were thinking.
I think if you want to.
no problem.
That was my last slide, basically, what are like the critical things that would be required? And I think the first thing is having some kind of mandate, right? Some kind of targets, some political will behind this is quite, I think it's a non-starter. And then figuring out how to do the funding. This was something that Anmol and I've talked a little bit about in this, and we talked about, well, because we did a study tour as well with the DCSU, some of the World Bank energy efficiency people. We talked a lot about the systems benefits charge, which is how the DCSU gets its funding, as it's described. And as far as I know, there's only one country that has a similar charge that utilities bear to fund these energy efficiency programs, and that's in Brazil. And that has worked pretty well. They've had different discussions, though, about how to allocate the funds, because originally it was just like utilities using it and going after the cheapest and easiest things. And also, then if you create mandates in certain sectors, you can end up with quite inefficient allocation of funds. So how do you kind of try to set up the incentives such that you're meeting your sustainable, equitable, social goals, but also efficiently allocating these projects? So there can be auctions or competitive applications. But I think that figuring out the funding is quite important, because I mentioned in South Africa, you had something like this, but then the budget gets cut and the program goes away. So how do you in developing countries, it can be, if there's huge subsidies, it doesn't really make sense to have this utility charge or an additional charge on end users. And I guess unless you're going to do it in specific classes, maybe that can afford it. But you need to think about it. I mean, when you have highly utilities that aren't functioning, government budget allocations that are not reliable, this approach of on-bill financing can be excellent to give you some sort of a more reliable source of funding. So I think it's like trying to find the right configuration of a country that either doesn't have high subsidies, where there may be some political will to add a charge like this. If not, then trying to find some more stable source of revenue to keep them alive. And well, sorry, one last thing, we're just trying to find ways to recycle the funds within the sustainable energy utility itself, right? So it's not just a one-way flow, but there are some models where there's repayment and those funds can be reused.
And to a large extent, that's sort of my mandate at DCSU too, is how do we reduce the reliance on system benefit charges, or recognizing that the existence of a charge is political too. You know, there could be a shift in administration and suddenly decide, you know, the thing I'm going to do is just reduce your bill immediately instead of waiting for efficiency to kick in 2 years from now by taking off this benefits charge. So we've always recognized shifting political winds as a threat to our business model. So we ourselves are figuring out, all right, now how do we sustain the sustainable energy utility and reduce our reliance on system benefit charges? And maybe we won't reduce our reliance to zero, but if we are able to show that there's a way we can leverage more resources, that makes it even more attractive for new cities who want to get onto this, because now the amount of system benefit charge they need to charge is lower. So it becomes much more sellable. So we absolutely are exploring every way possible. And this is complete blended finance approach. So we are going for grants, donations, concessionary capital, commercial capital, whatever it takes, wherever it makes sense. So for the upcoming winter season, or the heating season as we call it, we have been given the mandate by the Mayor of the DC government to run the emergency heating and cooling program for the district, which focuses on the elderly and the disabled. In case their boiler breaks down, they give us a call. And we have about $1 million to run that, but that $1 million typically runs out in the first 3 weeks of the heating season. So what we are trying to do is launch roundup and point of sale campaigns at retail stores, where you're able to put into that fund as a consumer. So that way we are leveraging donations to help a class of customers that need more help than we can afford to give right now. So we're doing all that we can to reduce our reliance.
Thank you. What opportunities do you see working along successful utilities, like for instance PG&E, that are already meeting their targets and exceeding, or would you not prioritize those markets?
Like I said, there are certain utilities who do a great job, and we are certainly not saying that we have to take this part of their business from every utility. So where someone is hitting all the industry benchmarks, doing a great job with ratepayer funds, they should continue doing that. But we also know that when it comes to the social justice goals, we do better because we have the non-profit mindset. We know how to run workforce development programs. We know how to reduce inequality, because ultimately that's the DNA of our organization. So if that is a priority of the mayor of a city in California that's being served by PG&E, and PG&E is not doing that, then we are more than happy to help them achieve those goals. But ultimately, go back to what Megan said, we are driven by political will to a large extent, because this is not something everyone wakes up and thinks of doing.
Is there any look to the horizon to, you kind of touched on this already, but to self-sustain, given that there is so many varied financial vehicles out there, both internationally and locally, if there was some sort of, versatility organizationally speaking, or is that just too much of a burden and it's just too much to ask of a single organization to be able to comprehend and react to?
I mean, that is my mandate and my team's mandate. My team is called the leveraging team, and the whole point is to leverage ratepayer funds to increase our impact and leverage in more funds. So, like I said, we have all of the above approach. So right now, we have a development manager on the team, a corporate engagement manager, and a financial analyst, and we're trying to get all the kind of money we can to increase the impact and reduce our reliance. And if we prove this blended finance approach out in DC, we're gonna replicate this in Vermont and Ohio and wherever else we start working in Wisconsin. But this is sort of our laboratory right now for that approach.
Quick follow-up question. Are you guys concerned that as other organizations that try, probably learn the same lessons you do, that there might be some eroding of the efficacy of that in the typical self-sustaining want that organizations and startup organizations tend to do, or the general market tends to slowly crave more self-sustaining funds than actual effective funds? Or is there anything like that, or any kind of mechanisms you guys are looking to use to kind of support that off or avoid that long term?
No, I mean, we welcome competition, and none of these ideas are really intellectual property. If you can prove it works in one city, someone else is welcome to replicate in some other city. There is incumbency is very powerful in this business, and we have that contract in DC. No one else does. So but if someone has this contract in Baltimore and wants to replicate our work here, they're more than welcome to do it.
Yes.
Yes, I was wondering if World Bank or also the CSU have experience with community choice aggregation, and in California actually they're managing energy efficiency programs, and they're highly effective. And I was wondering if this model could be replicated in developing countries, or if you have any thought about self-sustaining habits.
I have very little. I was just coincidentally looking at community choice aggregation just yesterday, but I'm not really familiar with that model that much, so I need to look into that more.
I have the same answer for you, unfortunately. I'm not sure what the World Bank is doing in that space. I haven't heard about it, but it could be that there's some dialogue happening that I'm not aware of.
Maybe, could you tell us a little bit about the California? What is the successful approach there? Do you know?
So it's community choice aggregation is a hybrid model, and has been available since the 1999. It first program started in Ohio and Massachusetts, and originally they would take over the procurement and generation of the electric services. In California, this model is available since 2010, and their business model is developing. They want to buy more, procure more renewable energy for the customers. So they have a base rate, 30%, 50% renewable energy, and then they also have opt-in tariffs for 100% renewable energy. So they're both supporting the development of renewable energy locally or regionally, and also managing energy efficiency programs. One is focusing more on EV for transportation, because transportation is a big polluter in California, but also for residential. They provide technical assistance, they provide maybe financing model with local banks, and so there's many examples, but this is like the basic. It's a hybrid model between a utility and municipal utility.
Just to piggyback off that as well, I was in May, I went with SICE on the energy track to San Francisco. We met with PG&E and CPUC Poland, and I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they said they were trying to switch the incentive so that instead of like PG&E getting paid on how much energy they produce, it's like how much, I think you mentioned it earlier, how much they're generating in efficiency standards, how much they can get people reduce their electricity consumption. So now they're looking at ways to like modernize the grid so that people use less electricity, right? Isn't
Yeah,
that
I
the
think they've
incentive
actually
they
done
put
that
in
already.
place?
That's already in place in California.
And ultimately, I think most utilities of the future will have a regulatory framework like that, especially in mature economies where energy consumption is not growing. You still have to get compensated, so they'll have to figure out ways on how they can get compensated for delivering savings and not just electrons.
So we still have time if there's, does anybody have any final questions? Yes?
How are you guys planning on policing bad actors in the space as they go for a lot of these long-term incentives that are going to be coming down in the next 10 to 15 years?
Can you give an example? What are you thinking of?
So I actually come from a background where these incentives are provided on the residential scale, affordable or new construction. And you have a lot of people coming out of the woodwork who figure out how to use it, how to apply it, and then they make it, they do what an organization does and they become very good at it and we're turning it around, but then the quality of those savings gets muddled. Flooding numbers, typical inefficiencies, and that kind of thing. And then that kind of gives leeway to just outright fraud. So these third parties, could be the utility itself or their vendors or contractors, but there's always going to be that third party verification, that policing that happens, and making sure that the quality and the confidence in the program itself remains viable. Otherwise, it could implode, potentially, hypothetically. So I'm wondering, as so many varied programs and sources of finances and vehicles come online, how is that being kind of managed from the broader 30,000-foot perspective on the international level?
Yeah, I can't answer for everyone, but just I mean, what the World Bank is doing, I think that there's always a tension between trying to scale up and trying to keep rigor, because they can be at odds. And we saw in the carbon finance world where the rigor ended up kind of crushing the system. So in the World Bank, it's quite important. We have a strong monitoring and verification framework, and now a lot of the multilateral development banks are agreeing on how emissions will be reported and tracked. And so there's going to be ex post monitoring that's required, and I mean we already have that in a lot of our projects, but it's going to be more rigorous against a baseline. And I think the third party verification is going to be an important part of that framework. We just want to make sure it doesn't go so far to where you're basically counting every electron saved or every ton of carbon reduced, and it ends up basically stopping the whole thing. So I don't have like a perfect solution, but I think it's going to be a learning by doing of how to learn from the experience of carbon finance, but still keep rigor in the system.
Anything to add?
No, I mean I agree with Megan. We are constantly, the constant trade-off is rigor versus, like you said, efficiency, to measure efficiency.
And so my kind of follow-up question to that was, if you guys are trying to scale or at least test bed the SEU model, you had a kind of a fiduciary or an escrow partner to DC to kind of allocate those funds, whether you had performed correctly or not. However, is there a body that you guys are going to analogously use for that scale on the international level, or are you just using what the World Bank has already been using as separate third parties to allocate that escrow for upcoming SCUs?
I mean, the body that's basically reviewing performance on an annual basis?
Yeah. If you guys are providing the funds, who's the extra body that's going to be clarifying the SCU, or those SCUs get those funds, or whatever performed above and beyond?
Yeah, it depends. I mean, depends on the project. There can be like an intermediary entity responsible for that work. I mean, the World Bank does that supervision though, and usually it's the responsibility of our clients to make sure that they're providing us with information that meets our standards.
Okay.
Great. So this was very good, and it seems like we do have one more final question here. So
Yeah.
please go ahead. We do have time.
So you talked a little bit about the risks of depending on funds coming from ratepayer surcharges, and I'm sure there's lots of people in this space who would argue that like public funds shouldn't be involved in this at all. You can just get private sector ESCOs to come in and make these investments, and that's fine. And I wanted to get your opinions. What do you guys feel are the most important reasons why it's preferable to have public money in this space, and are those reasons different in developing versus developed countries?
Go ahead.
I think that, so this is always a question that we're tested on and making sure, as I said, that we're efficiently using the public funding. Even for projects, the downfall of energy efficiency is this argument, honestly, that the private sector should do it because, if you look at the McKinsey cost curves, it's all has such a positive NPV, but it just never happens. So I think that you can only say that you're crowding out a market when there is a market. So I think that that's just something really important. We have to constantly fight this battle internally with, even with public street lighting, LEDs. Lighting is one of the most cost-effective measures that you could do, but it still doesn't happen because there's so many of these other barriers. And so I think, you can certainly justify public funds as to demonstrate, pilot, scale up, and there has to be a strategy to ultimately phase out, right? You don't want to just be doing this with no plan. Once these returns are proven and demonstrated in the market, no plan to bring in other investors. But I think there's always a role for the demonstration effect, and you have to always check in with yourself. If we've been demonstrating for 10 years, then maybe actually we're just misusing public funds. But usually there isn't a market to be crowding out yet in a lot of these areas.
What she said. No, but seriously, you're right. And there are statistical analysis we undergo every year to measure free ridership, to make sure that we're not using public funds for areas where they're not needed. And if our program design doesn't meet that test, we can't use public funds for it. So the industry has evolved to a place where we do take precautionary measures to avoid that. Secondly, to answer the other question about how it looks differently in the developing world, and I don't know the exact number, and maybe there is no exact number, but intuitively we know that vast majority of the building stock in the developing world is yet to be built, right? While the DCSU is mostly focused on retrofitting old buildings. So of course, at one level it has to look different. But that also gives you opportunities which are unimaginable right now, because think about it, an entire township that's being planned in the suburb of Bombay, the architect has a plan, right? Now imagine that the Bombay SEU steps in and tells the developer, we'll give you an incentive for improving the efficiency of this township, and helps them improve, basically avoids locking into a high energy footprint. That's the sort of opportunity that could really bend the emissions curve. And to me, that's the sort of exciting opportunity that lies.
Fantastic. Now I'm not going to allow any more questions. So let's thank Megan and Anu for a great presentation.